Thank you for the very kind invitation to speak here today from Rio. Thank you, Andrew, for, the nicest introduction. I'm really glad that's going to be taped because on my darkest days, I will listen to that again. I want to get started by thanking all the people that have supported me all along the way. And I'm hoping I can do this without too many tears. To my amazing partner in life, Sam, and my 2 boys. You mean the world to me. 10,000 million thank yous wouldn't be enough. To my family, my mom and my dad and my siblings, Sam's family, and to just friends that I've made along the way that I consider my in-town family, including a friend who surprised me and flew in from New York City. Thank you, Mark. Great to see you here. It's really important to have people in your life that you know you can count on and call at any time. And this is my list of people for so many reasons. Thank you for baklava delivered at my front door and long walks during the pandemic and so much more. I would not be able to tell you all about the incredible work that we have done without the honor and pleasure of working with so many incredible graduate students and postdocs. Angela, so good to see you here, and Sarah and Heather. It's been an absolute, continues to be an absolute pleasure and privilege. To all of the undergrads that we have collectively mentored, Ellen, great to see you. Grace and Julia, thank you for coming. You make the field work so fun. And thank you so much to folks in my department, people who during some really difficult times just stood up and gave me a big hug and helped get the job done, whatever was going on. I want to thank especially my colleague, Christy McCain, who is here somewhere, for the honor of this nomination, as well as the other nominating members of the team, Barbara Demick-Adams and Carol Westman. And thanks to so many of the colleagues who have helped either with teaching or with climate change communication, which I will tell you all about in a moment. So, like most humans, I have an incredible fascination with our natural world. To be able to pick one particular study system was probably the hardest decision I ever had to make, because I could have studied absolutely any of these things. Okay, maybe not snakes. We'll leave that to Drew. I am terrified. And I love thinking about really big picture questions in evolutionary biology, like the origin of species. And I'm really excited about this new edited volume that is just about to drop in a couple of months. Thanks to my editors here, this is a 30-chapter compendium of some of the latest breakthroughs in thinking about how we study the evolution of new species. And I tend to love to do a lot of field work. Yes, I like to get in my scrubs and get up at dawn and be out there in barns to investigate study systems that are comprised of closely related populations that are just starting to diverge, the very start of the process of speciation. Because it's in these systems that we can start asking questions about the how and the why these populations are diverging and maybe on their way to becoming species of their own. And I also, since 2011, have been working with an amazing team of scientists from all over campus: Max Boykoff, Environmental Studies; Beth Osinis, Theater and Dance; Phaedra Petsulo, Communications, and myself. And we've been thinking deeply about the communication of climate change and how difficult an enterprise that is. And so we consider ourselves a living lab situated in a university setting, an intentional space for development, experimentation with creative modes to communicate, evaluate, and confront climate change. And we do a lot of amazing things. We've held events to highlight several artists or folks who are experiencing most pressing the effects of climate change. We've had film festivals for the last 15 years. Suzanne Bailug, wherever you are, thank you for helping me with all of that. And just a shout out to Max and Beth, who are co-hosting a climate comedy night on Tax Day. Don't miss that. So we also teach 2 courses. And my course is focused on the art of science communication, and that is the translation of facts, first finding facts, and then the translation of facts into compelling stories that help translate the science of climate change in ways that meet audiences where they are and try to convey a sense of inclusion and belonging, as well as to translate the science in as truthful and robust a manner. And we're living in this really bizarre time of disinformation and misinformation, and we talk a lot about that in this class. Many of my students get their news from social media. Maybe there's some fact-checking happening. Biased media platforms are very common out there, and it's often difficult to know who is trusted and why. This has really big implications for what we trust, who we trust, and what we believe in, and how we make really important decisions about the world, like whether we should get a new vaccine, or what we think about evolution, and what we think and know about the climate change crisis. And when you put those 2 things together, my interest in biodiversity and how it forms, and the role of communication in terms of the science of climate change, for me, the bottom line is humans. And humans are a massively interesting species. We have accelerated the growth of our population to just more than 8 billion individuals on our planet. And according to the UN, we are going to keep going. And this is a little scary, of course, because if you look at the evolutionary history on our planet, 4.6 billion years, we are really influential in so many ways that are perceptible, I think, to most of us, in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, forest fires, ocean acidification, mass extinctions, and of course, Earth's melting ice. We've had such a profound influence on our planet that some have thought that we should call ourselves or document this as being in the era of humans, although the New York Times, after lots of meetings by the so-called experts, says we're not quite ready for that yet. I think I disagree. I think nuclear bombs kind of call that decision into question. The bottom line, humans have had tremendous impact on our planet. And so what I want to put forward is that we have a very complex and interesting relationship with our natural world. When we think about the evolutionary history, again, of our planet and all of the life forms that have come before us, our most recent common ancestors evolved about 6 to 8 million years ago. That sounds like a long time, but relative to the age of our planet, that's a snap of a finger. And humans, our own species, came onto the scene about 300,000 years ago. So we are a very young species. And our evolutionary history tells a story of adapting to lots and lots of climate change. And this is a really nice interactive timeline from the Smithsonian's Human Origins Project. And I want you just to focus on this top panel here, showing the fact that over the evolutionary history, of our ancestors and our own species, our climate has fluctuated dramatically. And in this panel, what you're seeing in blue bars is times over our evolutionary history where our climate has been very unstable and has fluctuated. And this also are times that have been very creative in terms of the development of all sorts of interesting technologies. Humans are a species that are often on the move, and that is still very much the case today. When we left Africa, the thinking is that there was a major drought, prompting people to disperse and move. We moved to places that now cover our entire planet. So we are a brave species. We are a migratory species. We're an adventurous species. Wherever we've been, we leave behind beautiful artifacts. So we are artists and we are storytellers, and we have been for a long period of time. And so if we consider our species, we have a complex relationship with the natural world. We are young. We've experienced a lot of climate variability in our very short evolutionary history. And we've developed really important technologies in the face of all of this climate variation. We move around a lot, we're artists, we're storytellers, and we have a very deep and innate curiosity about our natural world. And yet we have modified our planet at such an unprecedented rate and scale that I don't think I need to describe what's happening in any of these vignettes in terms of the influence that our species has had on our planet. A major turning point in the evolutionary history of humans came at the end of the Great Ice Age, the Pleistocene, about 18,000 years ago, when these big ice sheets and glaciers started to retreat and our planet warmed into its current configuration. And Tyler Jones, an amazing climatologist, and I were looking for better representations of this transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. If you know of one, let us know. We both did our sleuthing. And this is an important transition in human evolutionary history for several different reasons, not the least of which is that as our climate warmed, we also began staying in place, and we began settling into farmsteads that evolved independently at least 14 different times across the world. And this is a really interesting archaeological site that dates back to about 9,000 years. It is a representation of what a Neolithic, a period at the start of the Holocene, farm, city, homestead would look like. And it is exceptional for many different reasons. One, it represents one of the largest aggregations of human populations, about 8,000 people at its peak. So this is the origin of very early city life and communal living. And it also represents the first construction of permanent homesteads, as well as a little bit later, the domestication of animals and plants. And so over the course of evolutionary history, we've lived side by side with the animals that we have domesticated. And in medieval times, this is a drawing of a medieval homestead. These domesticated animals actually lived side by side with us in our homes. They were great sources of heat. The families could keep them close at hand so they wouldn't be susceptible to being stolen. And we very much had this integrated life with non-human animals in our built environment. Nowadays, we're pretty choosy about who we bring into our home. These are my two dogs. But there are species who snuck their way in to our very early homes and have been with us ever since. So how many of you have ever had a mouse infestation in your home? You are very familiar with this humble species, which is the first long-term hunter-gatherer settlements transformed ecological interactions and food webs, allowed these commensal house mice to outcompete wild mice and establish durable populations that expanded with human societies. And the barn swallow is aptly named barn swallow because it is a species that also lives close at hand with human populations. And in most places in the northern hemisphere, in the months of March, April, or May, you can see this beautiful bird arriving back from its non-breeding grounds in the southern hemisphere, getting ready to establish a nest, line it with feathers, attract a mate, and get on with the business of reproduction. And barn swallows are one of the most widely distributed bird and vertebrate across our entire world. When I look back at the inside structures of these very early human homes from the Neolithic, I see places where barn swallows could build their nest. And they do. These are more modern pictures of barn swallow nests hanging out in rafters that are very similar to the inside of a home from the reconstruction at the Kuhulik site in Turkey. When we look at other types of human homes during the Neolithic with these massive thatched roofs, I also see places where barn swallows would happily make their home, and they still do. And barn swallows at this point nest exclusively on human-constructed structures all around the world. They've been with us a long time. There are hieroglyphs in the Great Pyramids in Egypt that are portrayals of swallows. They adorn Bronze Age pottery dating back 4,000 years. They are found in cave paintings in Greece, in France, and they are an important part of human storytelling dating all the way back to ancient Egyptian civilizations through hieroglyphs, as well as more modern storytelling about the myth of living side by side with human populations all over the world. Barn swallows are the animal that are most represented in our postage stamps. They are the most common tattoo. And during the pandemic, I worked with a very talented undergrad, Avani Fachon, who has a very amazing graphic design skill set and was interested in creating a website to document all of the interactions that humans have had with barn swallows for thousands of years. So check this website out. It's absolutely thrilling. So barn swallows have a massive distribution, absolutely reaching just about every corner of our planet. In orange here shows their breeding distribution, in blue shows wintering habitats, and then the purple space shows places where they stay put during the year. So a question that we've had is, did barn swallows expand as humans expanded into the northern hemisphere? Does this distribution is it in part explained by our own species movement and settlement across the northern hemisphere? And if that does line up, if barn swallows did expand with humans, we would see two signatures and a lot more, one of which is that barn swallow expansions into the northern hemisphere should be concomitant with human expansions into the northern hemisphere around 12,000 years ago. And that places where these populations come back together in space should coincide with human settlement patterns. And so we tested the evolutionary history of the species using a lot of different genomic data. This is a graduate student, Dr. Javon Carter, who put together this evolutionary family tree of barn swallows, which tells us a couple of really important things. First, it tells us that all of the barn swallows that are distributed across the northern hemisphere are all more closely related to one another than either is to a member outside of this group. And that's important for evolutionary biology because if you're going to compare the evolutionary histories of different species, you want to know that they're all part of the same closely related group. The evolutionary history is not very well resolved, which is exciting because this confirms, again, that this is a very young species. These populations are not yet fully distinguished independent evolutionary lineages. And another thing we were fascinated by is that the appearance of these birds does not at all predict their evolutionary relationships, which gives us an interesting clue about evolution once these populations started dispersing across their gigantic range. And so the question of whether human expansions coincide, barn swallow expansions coincide with human expansions is an investigation that required a lot of genomic data. Genomic data that we have collected all over the world and have developed full genomic sequences for. And a really talented grad student, Dr. Chris Smith, put together this portrait looking at the demographic history of barn swallows and came up with support for the hypothesis that these populations started expanding dramatically at the start of the Holocene, around 12,000 years ago. And shout out to Nolan Kane, who is also an author on this paper, and Sam Flaxman. This work would never have happened without them. Okay, so that works. And then the second question is, do contact zones in Asia coincide with human activity? The idea being, if barn swallows somehow follow humans and settle where humans are, that we should see a signature of human presence where we see these populations overlapping. And so we have traveled across the entire breeding range of these barn swallows. And I want to introduce a really awesome former postdoc, Liz Guardado, who has a very productive lab of her own. She did all of these field transects across Asia over the course of 3 different years, discovering really important things about these locations where these distributions of barn swallows collide. And I want you to pay attention to one of these zones. This is between 2 different subspecies, one that is more European distributed and another that's more Asian distributed, because we know something about human activity in that part of the world. And what we know is that that exact transect where Liz was sampling has been there for a long time, and it was initiated several thousand years ago as a trading route along the old Silk Road. And so to study the question of whether these contact zones shown by these different colored distributions colliding into one another in Asia is also a question related to a lot of genomic data and evolutionary history. And here I want to acknowledge Dr. Drew Shield, who has now started his own research lab at the University of Virginia. And again, using a lot of genomic data and modeling, we found evidence that these contact zones here between these different subspecies in Asia are very recent, certainly on the time scale of human activity in that region. And so the question of whether barn swallows expanded with humans, at least given the evidence we have so far, seems to be quite powerful. And there's a lot more nuance and layers to this work that we are following up on. And so barn swallows and humans indeed expanded into the northern hemisphere in a shared built environment about 12,000 years ago. And this brings me back to some of the original points about our species having a complex relationship with the natural world. We have modified our planet at an unprecedented scale and rate, and the building of permanent settlements and houses was a major inflection point in the evolutionary history of humans, and we have also influenced the evolution of life around us. The barn swallow is just one of many examples that we have influenced the evolutionary history of. So we have literally brought barn swallows to all of the corners of the earth that humans inhabit. And as I've been able to travel around the world, it's always just amazing to me to see these birds in all kinds of different settings, whether it's highly urbanized areas in Hong Kong, very rural villages in China. They reside under most of the culverts that connect our campus to the city of Boulder. Sarah Garcia spends a lot of time over those culverts, and they also live in rural agricultural areas. But I didn't study barn swallows to think about their interactions with humans. I was really enchanted by this group of animals because some of them live in highly social groups, and some of them live alone. And from an evolutionary perspective, I was really curious about why they're not doing just one thing, and what are the benefits of living in a group or the cost of living in a group versus the benefits of living solitarily. And I was excited to choose this study system because a lot was known about it. There'd been a lot of work done by a scientist in Europe, Anders Moller, who had been publishing a lot of different compelling research about the length of these tail streamers and everything fabulous that a bird could do. So if your tail streamers are longer, you are sexier. If your tail streamers are longer, you are healthier. If your tail streamers are longer, you have greater levels of testosterone, on and on and on. And I thought, great, I've got this bird that we know a lot about, and I set up shop in a lot of different farmsteads in Ithaca, New York, and I measured, and I measured, and I measured these tail streamers, and I found no patterns at all. Nothing. And my advisor, who was not very nice anyway, told me to keep going back and measuring and measuring. And I decided, something is just not going right here. I mean, I do trust my data, and we, by year 3, had thousands of data points, because barn swallows are very numerous. And I started noticing that barn swallows also have a lot of variation and a wash of color. Mark Hauber, who is my next door office mate when we were both grad students and surprised me by showing up today, thank you, was there for this ride of sorting out that something really different is happening in the population that we were studying in North America compared to all of the tales about tails that were coming from Europe. And I became really obsessed and enchanted by the bigger picture of what was happening with this bird and why there might be different mate selection decisions happening in different parts of the world. And since the early days of my postdoc, I started really thinking about questions related to speciation and considered adopting this study system as a model for studies of speciation and evolution in action. And they're very enticing for several reasons. One is that they're really widespread. They encompass a lot of environmental territory. They have similar habitats across their entire range. That is, they build these mud cup nests that are closely associated with human structures. They're aerial insectivores, so they don't defend any feeding territories. They feed on the wing, and they feed on a very ephemeral resource. And throughout, there's all sorts of fascinating variation in morphology and migratory behavior. And variation is definitely the stuff of any evolutionary study. And so we've been studying these traits and why they vary across space for decades at this point. And people always wonder, how in the world do you study these birds that just fly like crazy and are actually hard to follow with your naked eyes? And the answer is that we get up very early in the morning and we set up nets at their breeding sites, and we very gently capture them in these nylon nets, and they sit very still in a pocket. And we can measure all kinds of things, their shape, their size. We can bring back samples to the lab to get all sorts of genomic data. We can mark individuals to figure out who's socially paired with whom. We have to take all of the blood samples back to the lab from nestlings because on average, 3 out of the 5 nestlings are sired by another male at the site. There's a lot of interesting things going on here. And with the inspiration by Mark Halbert to start using magic markers in an experimental setting on birds, we can also manipulate these aspects of their morphology to look for causal relationships between reproductive success and various dimensions of their traits. And when we do these experiments across different subspecies, what we find is that, in fact, one of the reasons that they look quite different from one another has to do with very different mate selection decisions in those different subpopulations. And I don't get to talk about all of the amazing work that we've been doing since 1998 and on, but I am so grateful for the collaboration and company of so many students and all the wee hours all around the world. And we've been able to travel to some pretty incredible places on our planet. So this is a transect that I was able to do in 2017 across the Gansu province of China. Has anyone been there? Just one. It's not exactly a tourist destination, and it's pretty far off the beaten path. And this is what it looks like from space. This is the city that we ended up studying at. Zooming in closer, and there are literally replicates of this exact type of village across the landscape. And our big plan was to go back with a brand new NSF grant, 2019, and to do all these amazing experiments across this really cool replicated landscape where the human habitations look really similar, so that's a good control. And every single doorway just about had a barn swallow nest. And the people we met there are absolutely fascinating. We spent a lot of time through my collaborator and former student, Lu Yu, learning about human relationships with swallows in this part of the world and trying to convince these amazing humans to let us catch their birds, sometimes with mixed success. And we were there to study population genetic divergence in that region where 2 different subspecies collide. And we were really puzzled about why it is that these populations can sit literally on top of each other, but they don't seem to be interbreeding or choosing one another as mates. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to figure out, is there something about their migratory behavior that is influencing their reproductive behavior? So we put these geolocator tags that are about 0.5 gram on a backpack. Miriam Eckert, wherever you are, you have helped me put these on. And these little sensors can last and collect data for 9, 10, 11 months if you're lucky. We deployed 70 of these across the Gansu province, came back the next year with massively crossed fingers in the hopes that we could recover some of these tags to figure out their migratory behavior. And what we found is that if you are more red-like in your genomic ancestry, you take a pretty long trip across the Tibetan Plateau and end up in Eastern Africa during the winter. And if you're more Guturalis-like in your ancestry, you stay on the continent, go south, and spend the winter in Sri Lanka. And this has really massive implications for not only the amount that these birds travel in a given year. These birds are traveling about 3 times less than these, but their arrival times are very much off sync by about a month. So these populations are literally side by side, but by the time these birds get back from Africa, the other birds that have overwintered in Asia have long started the reproductive process. And we think that the origin of some of these behaviors are these really high deserts as well as the Tibetan Plateau, which for an 18, 17 gram bird would be very difficult to traverse. And so as we've made all of these journeys across the world, it's also obvious that the habitats that barn swallows reside in are quickly given way to more urbanized, multiple unit dwellings. So these are pictures of 2 of our study sites in China, where the villagers said, I wouldn't put a tag on the birds here because we are all moving to these high rises next year and our villages are going to be destroyed. And this comes at a time when the news came out that just in North America alone, we have witnessed the loss of more than 3 billion birds since 1970, 3 billion birds. And this incredible study documented all of the patterns by different foraging styles and different groups of birds. And what was, of course, of great interest to our group is that things that fly around eating insects are really, really susceptible to climate change, human development, and more. And so we've seen a decline in these groups of birds, a precipitous decline since 1970. This decline is really apparent in the most northern latitudes of North America, where in Canada, barn swallows are now species that are listed as threatened or a priority species for conservation. And this is wild to me because we have traveled across the world banding, measuring tens of thousands of these swallows. It's inconceivable to think about these populations no longer being present. And so it begs the question of what this long shared story of humans and barn swallows side by side is going to look like. And then came the winter of 2020. We were excited about this new NSF grant. We were working on getting visas to go to China. We were trialing all the technology that we needed to take with us, and the pandemic hit. And there were wars, and climate change, and human migrations, and mass shootings, and mass extinctions. And I think because, like everybody else, I was home and so tuned into the news, and also personally depressed because of lack of international travel and the decline of barn swallows, I turned to sourdough. Thank you, Sarah and Nolan, for the sourdough starter. How many of you baked sourdough during the pandemic? And there's my son doing online school with our new puppy who we dressed up in all kinds of things because what are you going to do when you're home? I have a really special friend and colleague named Beth Osnes, and she is, I don't even know how to describe Beth. You just can't knock her down. She is one of the most optimistic, creative humans I've ever met, and we had been doing these intensive writing sessions for, I think, about 7 or 8 months by the time the pandemic hit, where we would work together for a period of 3 hours on whatever project we wanted to work on, just dreaming up all kinds of crazy things. And when I knew that I couldn't be in China as planned, Beth was like, let's just do something together. Let's just go outside. And we met masked, and I remember taking this picture, and we're like, oh, I don't know, we're too close together. Are we going to get in trouble? And we met at this little bridge that's part of the Bear Creek footpath. And Beth, being the creative genius that she is, decided that we would start directly studying the relationships of humans and barn swallows side by side through art and scientific approaches. I don't know if many of you have a friend like Beth, but Beth has gotten me to do the craziest things. When I did go to China, she packed me with these skin-tight green suits and asked me just to wear these in, Trafalgar or Tiananmen Square. Like, you know what, Beth? I might not make it home after doing that. But Beth is one of the bravest, amazing humans. And we made a good use of the time that summer. We started a project that we call Side by Side. And I want to just shout out to the many of students and our fearless project director, Chelsea Hackett, also a creative genius, as well as Shaheen Raudbari, who is, we affectionately call him our pesky little brother because he is very mischievous and incredibly creative. And we came up with this project, and the mission is to support young women in co-authoring a way beyond the climate crisis through an art-science approach, rich interspecies friendships, a sense of belonging in in the natural world and STEM learning communities, and by sparking constructive hope for the future. So you might ask, why are we focusing on female identifying youth? Because we still need to. Just to sort of guess, just a shout out, what year do you think this book was published in? The title is Women and the Challenge of STEM Professions, Thriving in a Chilly Climate. What would you think, 1960s? Anyone give me a guess. You know where I'm going. So this book came out in 2022, along with dozens and dozens of other papers related to a women's place in STEM, and also in a more focused manner, overcoming the very well-described and very well-known gender bias that is still very pervasive in my own field, which produces more female PhDs than male PhDs at this point. So why are we still here? We're paying attention to this. The goals are to cultivate a sense of belonging, to utilize embodied learning, this is all Beth and Chelsea, to explore a side-by-side approach, to inspire constructive hope, and most importantly, to elevate the voices of our youth before they are too jaded and cynical, perhaps. And shout out to some of our amazing interns who are going to be working with our youth this summer. One of the things that this work is grounded on is a lot of data suggesting that when you have individuals that have a sense of belonging in STEM, and you have a diversity of voices and groups and ideas, we always reach better solutions more quickly. Bar none, in business settings, educational settings, art settings. And another project during the pandemic was to wrestle with this idea of how could we, as a STEM research lab, think about tracking and increasing a sense of belonging in the group that we perhaps can most closely evaluate. And so we wrote this paper. Every single member of the lab is a co-author. I see Mike here, and I see Marina here. And this was just a great project that got us started in actually studying a sense of belonging in our own lab group. And we do this 2-3 times a year so that we can actually discover, are there soft spots? What does the anonymous survey data tell us about people's sense of belonging and sense of value in our lab? We can actively work to increase that. We think about embodied art science experiences as transformative disruption. I never, ever would have ever thought that I would be wearing a pair of cardboard wings anywhere in the world, but of course, all of these students did this. We tasked our second group of interns with matching them by color, favorite foods, to a local bird species they could observe. And we watched and worked with them as they started charting and documenting their observations of their bird through both art science observations and approaches. And I love this because as a scientist, I go into the field, I've got my clipboard, I know what I'm after, and I've got blinders on, right? And these students have just wild and crazy ideas, and they're not worried about peer review and IOCUC and grants and all the things that I worry about, and their ideas are amazing. By the end of the summer, we do all sorts of things to highlight the amazing work that they've done, and we've had museum exhibits, we've had processions in the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. We've had films go on and win awards at dozens of film festivals around the world, and we've collected data on their experience, and we know that participation in our program increases science identity, connectedness to nature, and increased feelings of efficacy about environmental action. Great. And so after trialing this for 3 years, we decided, let's write an NSF grant. Awesome. And this is me and Avani, Shaheen, and Beth, and Chelsea, and our amazing grants person, Christy Winsek. And this is us celebrating the submission of our grant to a program we had never submitted to, where we asked for $3.5 million. And when the program officer called me in May to say, who are you? Do you know that these grants are for like the Shedd Aquarium and like, you know, the American Museum of Natural History? We like your idea, but we're going to put you in a different category. Got to tone it down a bit. And we ended up with a magnificent project that Dr. Chelsea Hackett is the director of. And we are in the throes now of just getting it launched. So many moving parts, so much excitement. When I started studying barn swallows as a grad student in Cornell, I considered this my absolute happy place. I love being among the birds. I, for some reason, love being in a barn. I don't know why. And I never, ever would have imagined a transformation that would lead me into studying the effects of embodying a bird as a way to think about increasing belonging in STEM. And our research program is changing because our birds are declining. So we're unable to go to Asia and do all of those cool experiments, but we'll spend time this summer sampling across populations that we know are declining precipitously to start asking questions about the how and the why. And I want to go back to where I started, which is that we have a really complex relationship with our natural world. We are young. We've experienced a lot of climate change before, and yet we've developed new technologies to make it through, even when we were at the brink of extinction. We move around a lot. We are artists and storytellers, and we have a very deep curiosity about our natural world. And yet we have modified our planet at an unprecedented rate and scale, and we've influenced the evolution of life around us at an unprecedented rate. But I want to hold on to this idea that we've been here before as a species, and that in our evolutionary history, baked in very deep, is the ability to withstand massively changing climates and to develop new technologies and ideas, and to maintain a deep curiosity with our natural world, and to be artists and storytellers, to tell the stories of how we are doing all of these things. Ruha Benjamin was here last week, standing right here, and I had just finished reading her book before she came to speak, and I was sitting right there and really admiring the ask, which is, this is an invitation to rid our mental and social structures from the tyranny of dominant imaginaries, and a field guide for seeding imagination grounded in solidarity, in which our underlying interdependence as a species and planet is reflected back at us in institutions and social relationships. We can do better. I am really inspired by movements in sustainable architecture, such as the work coming out from Paul Dobrajic, who contends that we can open up new ways of thinking about our human-built environment to accommodate the more than human. I'm also inspired by all sorts of ways of reimagining the human homestead that isn't designed to keep out the critters, but to make room for them in a way that I think benefits us all. And so we've been here before, and we are capable of amazing things. Our imagination is boundless, our creativity. We are hardworking and creative and industrious. And my question for everyone here is, can we rise to the challenges that are in front of us now? These precipitous declines in any metric of environmental quality, this immense increase in extinctions, this degradation of our environment. And as we think about this question, and we each may come up with different answers, I want to remind you that as a species, we've always been deeply enchanted by and inspired by our natural world. For good reason. Sometimes we've just simply needed to know what we could eat or what could eat us. But all the artifacts of our evolutionary history show some storytelling and portrayal of the more than human world. And as you think about this and are inspired by our natural world, lean into the people that love you the most, because we are a social species and it is a hard time to be living, and we need one another to boost one another up. It's been amazing to work with such incredible scientists over the course of this journey. And these people remind me every day that you must have joy to be able to do the good and hard work. As my dear friend Max Boykoff always says, up with hope. And I think what is the glue that keeps us together, because we have no time for this extra work, is that we dearly love one another, we spend time with one another, and we really believe in the work we're doing. Find good people and be bold. You can ask for $3.5 million. You might not get it. We didn't. But great things are happening. And with that, I want to say thank you for coming. Thanks to my funding agencies, students, and more.